Welcome to another George Consortium COVID-19 Law and Policy Briefing, presented by our colleagues around the country in association with Public Health Watch at Northeastern University, the Center for Public Health Law Research at Temple University, and the Week in Health Law podcast. We're here to hopefully provide expert legal analysis during the COVID-19 pandemic, and if you've got them, we'll try and answer some of your questions. I'm Nicolas, a professor at Indiana University McKinney School of Law. Joining me today are Dr. Michael Sinha, Research Fellow at the Harvard-MIT Center for Regulatory Science, and Professor Patricia Zettler from the Ohio State Moritz College of Law. We're going to be taking questions, as I mentioned, towards the end of the broadcast, and you can ask them on Twitter at PHLAWWatch, that's PHLAWWatch, or with the hashtag COVID Law Briefing. So, distinguished panelists, President Trump has consistently encouraged coronavirus patients to try new pharmaceutical treatments. Phrases that we have come to know and love, such as, "So what do I know?" and, quote, "I'm not a doctor, but I have common sense." And perhaps my favorite of all, "What do you have to lose?" So, Michael, what are these apparent treatment options, these things that are being floated by the president and by others? What do they do or not do, as far as we know at the moment? And how does what is their regulatory status, if you like?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of COVID-19 therapies, we really have to think about two different pathways. So the pathway to a new therapy versus repurposing old existing drugs. And so given the cost and time that is associated with new drug development, the quick fix is obviously to try to study old therapies. And so hydroxychloroquine is the drug that the president keeps mentioning. It has been used or trialed with or without azithromycin. It's an old drug. It's commonly used for malaria. It's also used for lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. It did show some promise against SARS-CoV-2 in cell culture studies, but really disappointed in human trials. There was a famous French study with extremely limited data. It was an open-label study. It was not randomized. It was fairly inconclusive and has actually been highly discredited. The journal that published the study itself even agreed that it did not meet expected standards for publication, although the article has not been retracted. Now, the real concern here is that there are severe side effects, especially cardiac side effects or QTc prolongation, that has been seen with COVID-19 patients. And so this problem occurs more in higher doses, and it occurs even more with azithromycin, which can also prolong the QTc interval. In fact, a study in Brazil was recently stopped due to cardiac side effects. So the key here is that hydroxychloroquine has not been rigorously studied in randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled studies, which is the gold standard, and I think which we need to expect from therapies for COVID-19. Remdesivir is another drug that's under investigation. So this is Gilead's investigational treatment for Ebola and Marburg disease. It's not been approved, but Gilead has been giving the drug out under compassionate use protocols. A recent study in the New England Journal of Medicine showed some promising data, but really more study is needed in a controlled fashion. This study in the New England Journal was essentially a case series, and many have pointed to the fact that there were more authors on that paper than there were actual patients enrolled in that study. And so I think really the best approach is to access and study the drugs via clinical trials. And I've noticed that there are, in fact, disparities in access to compassionate use in clinical trials in the setting of COVID-19, even here in Boston. The major Harvard affiliate hospitals, of course, have free access to the drug for enrollment in clinical trials and for compassionate use. The Safety Net Hospital, from what I'm hearing, has not been able to access the drug, even for compassionate use. There are some other antiviral meds with inconclusive data. So lopinavir, ritonavir, which is an HIV therapy, it showed some limited value in SARS, but does cause liver injury in some patients. Ribavirin is another drug, an older drug that worked well in SARS, but actually causes hemolytic anemia in over half of patients. So it's potentially very dangerous, especially if we're thinking about treating millions of people. And oseltamivir or Tamiflu hasn't really shown any effect against SARS or this current SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19. The last real approach that I've seen potential promise for is immunoglobulin therapy, so taking convalescent plasma from someone who has recovered and infusing that into a sick patient. There's some anecdotal evidence of benefit, but again, this is not well studied. And really, I think the final thing we're really going to need to get through this is to get a vaccine developed, right? And so I think we're at least a couple years away on vaccines. There are over 70 that are in development and 3 are in human clinical trials. But we really need these to be rigorously studied, both drugs and vaccines, because we're going to be using these in potentially hundreds of millions or billions of people. So getting the evidence right is extremely important here.
So Patty, let's turn to you with that phrase, what do you have to lose? Can you level us up on what it means to have clinical trials? What does the FDA do? Why does it take time? And so on.
Yeah, so I think it's very understandable for people to think we're in the middle of this historic pandemic. We don't have time to wait. We need drugs or vaccines for COVID-19 now. And if an individual patient wants to take the risk of taking something that's not proven or maybe has known serious side effects, but no evidence or limited evidence of effectiveness for COVID-19, that person should be able to decide to do that. I think that's sort of an understandable impulse. But the reality is, as Michael said, that we can't afford not to do clinical trials and have good evidence right now. So we can think about FDA's role in requiring clinical trials and requiring pre-market approval for drugs and vaccines as protecting us physically from unsafe and ineffective products. But a really key part of FDA's role in approving products is not just that we're all physically protected from unsafe and ineffective products, but instead companies are forced to develop the data and the information that we need to understand whether drugs and vaccines do what we think they might. And without clinical trials, without good data, we'll never know what works and what doesn't for COVID-19, and that's bad for individual patients, and that's bad for all of us on a public health level. We might, another way to think about it is it's not that FDA per se makes the drug approval process slow and long. It's that the reality is it's actually really difficult and time intensive and important to know exactly what medicines do. And, it will come as no surprise to the folks on this call that, I think we need a robust FDA. But the reality is whether we have an FDA or not, it would take time and money and would be difficult to do the hard work to figure out what works and what doesn't for COVID. I would encourage everyone to think about it like it's not a therapy, it's not a vaccine if it doesn't work. We really need to know what works and what doesn't.
So when you're dealing with a drug that is already out there to an extent, are there shortcuts in the clinical trials and FDA approval, or does it sort of more or less start all over again?
So if there's a drug that's already out there and it's already approved, then generally, but not always, physicians are free to prescribe it for whatever they see fit. So that's known as an off-label use. That can include.
I wasn't so much going for the off-label use. It's the process that the FDA, the clinical trials, whether there's a shortcut when it's an established drug.
When it's an established drug to get a new indication approved, there could be after the 2016 21st Century Cures Act. FDA can rely on what's known as real-world evidence to approve new indications for already approved drugs. So that could be something other than randomized controlled trials. And of course, if the drug's already approved, we already know a lot more about it than we know about something that's totally novel. We have a lot more sort of safety information about how it's used and things like that. So it can be faster. Here I would say, my sort of public health policy or law perspective would be we still need randomized controlled trials for those drugs that are already approved for the reasons that I and Michael sort of threw out there, which is, it's actually even more critical right now that we know what works and what doesn't.
So, notwithstanding everything the two of you have said, we hear that drugs like hydroxy are being stockpiled. Large quantities are being purchased. New York has been stockpiling. Can these be used? There's something called an emergency use authorization. There's compassionate use. Patty, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So as Michael mentioned, and as you just mentioned, Nick, I'll call it HCQ rather than the long name for the malaria drug because I'm terrible at pronouncing things. But HCQ is already approved, and so in general, physicians are free to prescribe it for COVID-19, even though it's not approved for that indication. Nevertheless, FDA has issued emergency use authorizations for the drug, and that's to allow the Strategic National Stockpile to distribute the drug for COVID-19. So basically, physicians could prescribe it anyway. The emergency use authorization for that drug is a mechanism to allow distribution for COVID-19 from the Strategic National Stockpile.
Application out of the emergency for use tribe. I thought in for education so does just starts back all the frequent position and at least I running I'll have already unethical and then six half use that also
for federal law, but probably I could say the FDA is not the only department of age pharmacy is also so I remember looking at the
to model and build that it does mean around
I encourage organizations the data and what's not there yet.
Yes, watch at noon Eastern. I was used by